Muy buenas noches, muy buenas tardes y muy buenos días.
Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. From Berlin, Germany, we begin the 290th live broadcast of Demolishing Myths Talks. Thank you very much for joining us, and please remember to help us out with a thumbs up against censorship. In this talk, we're joined by a distinguished guest, or rather an exceptionally distinguished one, with whom I've wanted to have a conversation for quite some time. Mr. Roniel Aledo, joining us from Miami, United States, former contractor for the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, also a former contractor and member of the DIA, another US agency, and a retired officer of the US Armed Forces. A truly impressive resume. Ron, welcome. How are things over there in Miami?
Ron, bienvenido. ¿Qué tal todo por ahí en Miami?
Hola, hola.
Hello. Delighted to be here with you, and thank you so much for the invitation.
Ron, muchos temas para...
Ron, there are many topics for this conversation. I'd like to start precisely with the issue featured on our cover: Zionism and anti-Zionism in the United States, and above all, within the Democratic Party. A party that has historically supported Israel, but within which, at present, anti-Zionist tendencies have emerged, opposing the state of Israel. Perhaps not so much among the leadership, which for now continues to back Israel as always, but rather within the electoral base of the so-called MAGA movement, the electoral base of Trumpism. What are we witnessing right now in the United States regarding this situation? Zionism and anti-Zionism within republicanism.
Yes, I wanted to note that it's the Republican Party. You said Democratic Party.
1,000 apologies. Within the Republican Party, of course. Yes, 1,000 apologies. Obviously a slip.
No, there's no problem. Look, the first thing to understand is that here in the United States there are only two parties. It's not like in Europe, where in Parliament there can be 6, 7, or 8 parties, each with a specific ideology. Regional parties from the Länder, the autonomous community or the province, or very specific parties with a clear ideology. The Greens for ecology, those who are against taxes, or some religious party in Northern Ireland. There are different ideologies, more of a pizza style, so to speak. But here, no, here there are only two parties. The other parties that exist are micro parties that have absolutely no kind of popular support, no voice or vote, and achieve nothing. There's the Pro-Independence Party of Alaska, the Pro-Independence Party of Texas, the Green Party, which is mostly an intellectual thing. A few thousand intellectuals go vote, but they don't really exist in the political landscape. There's the Democratic Party, which is associated with the center-left, and the Republican Party, which is associated with the center-right, the right, and that's it. That's all there is. What happens is that since there are only two parties, what occurs in practice is that these parties are actually a coalition of different ideologies. What in Europe would be 3 parties in a coalition, one of those governing coalitions they form. Here are ideological coalitions, but within the same party. Within the Republican Party, there are the fiscal conservatives, who want low taxes, the libertarians of the Austrian school, more or less in the Milei style, so to speak, who promote small government and personal freedoms, and so on. Then there are the social and religious conservatives, which mostly has to do with the Southern Protestants, what we call here the Bible Belt, Tennessee, Alabama, Texas, Georgia, South Carolina, who are very conservative from a religious and social point of view, and so on. And then there are the businessmen, those connected to the Cato Institute, who are more business-oriented and more libertarian and so on. So what happens? There's a great ideological variety within this large coalition called the Republican Party. And historically, the right-wing party, the center-right and right-wing party, had in its mindset a fanatical commitment to supporting the government of Israel to the very end, mostly because of the same Cold War mentality, the mindset of the 1970s and 1980s, up until the early 1990s, when Israel was portrayed as a U.S. ally in the region, against governments leaning toward the Soviet Union, and so on. But once the Cold War ended in 1991, that fanatical support for Israel still continued. It was no longer about the Cold War, no longer about fighting communism or socialism. Now it was about fighting Islamic extremism. They mutated it, changed the reason for the fanatical support. It was no longer to stop communism, the Soviet Union, or the Warsaw Pact. Now it was about supporting Israel just because the fight was against Islamic extremism, against bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, and so on. The thing is that, for one reason or another, the Republican Party, right-wing people, and the center-right have always fanatically supported Israel. And we have to understand that Israel has an incredibly powerful lobby here, the most powerful of all lobbies, called AIPAC. AIPAC is the lobby that practically dedicates itself to putting people in and taking people out of the U.S. Congress. If you say you want to be a congressperson, that you want to go to Congress, that you want to be a senator or representative, and you present yourself as fanatically pro-Israel, AIPAC will pour millions of dollars into your campaign. If you say you don't like Israel, that it's not a priority for you, you're on AIPAC's blacklist. AIPAC will very likely give millions to your opponent to keep you out of Congress. That's how things work here, along with the press, Fox News, and so on. What happened? Everything changed radically a little over 2 years ago with Hamas's attack on October 7th. Because there was a kind of discontent, obviously very widespread, among left-wing groups, so to speak, among more center-left groups, especially in universities, groups of young people affiliated with the Democratic Party. And obviously, for humanitarian reasons, they opposed the U.S. government continuing to support the massive bombings of civilians in Gaza, the Dahaya Doctrine, Israel's famous Dahaya Doctrine, which is massive punishment of the civilian population. It's written down. It's something they've been doing for years. They massively punish the civilian population, something that could be considered a war crime. That movement, mainly on the left here, university people who identify as progressive, liberal, and leftist, reached the ears of a group within the Republican Party. And this group is what's known as the most conservative faction within the Republican Party. They're the ones who call themselves, who are aligned with the old right, with the old right wing, with Pat Buchanan's mindset, with the America First mentality, the original America First of the 1990s. They simply uphold this ideology that the United States should not be the world's policeman, should not get involved everywhere, that we don't have to pursue Pax Americana at any cost, nor spread democracy at gunpoint, as Pat Buchanan used to say. And this paleo-conservative group of people within the Republican Party began doing something that had never been done before. The heresy of saying, hey, I don't think it's a good idea to keep sending money to Israel. I don't think it's a good idea to keep helping. We're contributing with taxpayers' money to the killing of thousands and thousands of children, women, and unarmed people in Gaza. We find this immoral.
y gente desarmada en Gaza. Esto nos parece inmoral. Estamos de acuerdo con lo que están diciendo los jóvenes.
We agree with what the left-wing university students are saying in the protests. So there was a kind of conjunction, a sort of affiliation or ideological coordination between the more conservative groups of the Republican Party, not the ordinary center-right folks, but the most conservative group, the paleo-conservatives, in the libertarian line of Ron Paul, in the paleo-conservative line of Pat Buchanan, and the left-wing groups that, for humanitarian reasons, oppose this. So there was a kind of congruence, and this had never been seen before in the United States.
Y esto nunca jamás se había visto en Estados Unidos. 3 años atrás, nadie jamás.
3 years ago, no one, absolutely no one, in the Republican Party would have ever said a word against Zionism. Neither Theodore Herzl, nor what Zionism represented, nor Greater Israel, nor the genocide they are committing. And today we are indeed seeing how voices like Candace Owens, who went from being a leftist, a conventional progressive, to a mainstream center-right figure, part of the establishment, and then to a paleo-conservative, was baptized as a Catholic, I believe, 2 years ago. Tucker Carlson is the most famous of the paleo-conservatives, a journalist from the United States, a Protestant, but he does not follow the conventional Protestant line of the American South. Rather, his stance is much more traditionalist, so to speak. He's also gone to Russia to interview Vladimir Putin. People who are talking about this topic, like Representative Thomas Massey and Marjorie Taylor Greene, the congresswoman from Georgia, one of the state's major figures who is, so to speak, the MAGA star, the star of the Republican Party, super conservative, aggressive, charismatic. All these people have come together to go against a kind of article of faith within the Republican Party. And that dogma, or pseudo-dogma, of the Republican Party was the fanatical, unwavering support for Israel, because they're our allies and the only democracy, blah, 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 blah. So we're seeing that there's been a kind of schism, a kind of division. Obviously, 80% of the party are the same old globalist neocons, with the same simplistic ideology as always. We must support Israel to the very end. Putin is Satan, Russia is Satan, Russia is still communist, the Soviet Union hasn't fallen yet, the Warsaw Pact is still there, blah, 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 blah. But there's about 15 or 20% of the people, those who call themselves ultra-MAGAs, those who call themselves true America First, who are seeing this exception, this schism. And this is the situation we find ourselves in today.
Muchas gracias, Ron, por esta contextualización.
Thank you very much, Ron, for this contextualization. Where do the exponents of this anti-Zionist movement appear within republicanism? In the realm of media figures, such as Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, and Charlie Kirk, who was recently killed, and, according to many, killed by Israel. Whether this is true or not, we cannot determine, but evidently, for many members of MAGA, that's how it is. So on that side, on the media side, or rather on the side of political figures, you just mentioned Buchanan, we could recall others as well.
Podríamos recordar a otros también. O quizás por el lugar.
Or maybe it's coming from the grassroots, the militant base, the electoral base, which suddenly starts questioning the sending of money to Israel. While on the other hand, in the United States, problems are multiplying precisely because of the lack of investment in many different areas, from infrastructure to any of the country's other issues, including the fentanyl problem. Where do you think this starts? More from the top or more from the bottom?
Comenzó por arriba, pero obviamente se ha hecho eco en las bases.
It started from the top. It started from the top. But obviously it has echoed among the grassroots, among ordinary people, in the MAGA base, in the America First base. Again, more context, because people have a hard time understanding how we see things from here, from the United States. And I've said it many times, I've told Colonel Banya many times, I've told many people. The major European media outlets, Deutsche Welle, Spanish television, French television, RAI, the BBC, all of them. come to Washington, D.C., and obviously just go along with the conventional media narrative of the establishment, the one pushed by CNN, CBS, all those outlets, without realizing anything else. They don't realize that that's only half the story, a rather biased story, with a premeditated ideology behind it.
Ideología ya premeditada, y simplemente van a Europa y la repiten otra vez como un lorito.
And they just go to Europe and repeat it again, like parrots, without understanding the other side of the coin, without digging into the situations that are happening. And let me explain so people understand. This started with Candace Owens. It started with Candace Owens. Candace Owens, again, this African-American woman who went from being a conventional, progressive girl, so to speak, center-left in college, gradually became more and more right-wing, more conservative. She joined the Republican Party, spent some time within what we call the establishment, the Republican Party bosses with that ideology. She made videos for Prager University, which is a super Zionist conservative organization, and worked for Ben Shapiro, who runs the Daily Wire, which is also super Zionist, very establishment.
Que también super sionista, super del establishment. Y de hecho la echaron precisamente por...
And in fact, they fired her precisely because of her criticism of Israel within the Daily Wire. She converted to Catholicism, I think about 2 years ago, and was heavily influenced by her husband, who is British. They follow a kind of very traditionalist version of Catholicism that clashes with what we call here in the United States Christian Zionism, which is what Protestants follow, the large Protestant masses, like Ambassador Huckabee himself, who is a Christian Zionist. It's the predominant ideology among Protestants in the United States. You have to fanatically support Netanyahu, because if you don't, you'll go to hell when you die. God wants you to support Netanyahu. Just look at Tucker Carlson's interview with Senator Ted Cruz, where Ted Cruz said it himself. I support Israel to the death because the Bible says so. You have to support Israel. So basically, you have to support Netanyahu or you'll go to hell. That's the ideology. It seems irresistible, but it's true. Obviously, that didn't sit well with Candace Owens, who converted to Catholicism with her British husband, who I believe is an heir to the House of Lords. Her family has relatives over there, like British lords, and they practice a very traditionalist form of Catholicism. And she started saying, look, I don't have to follow this heresy, this thing of Christian Zionism. I don't have to follow the Protestants. And she began to be very critical of Israel. We're killing children, we're killing women, we're leaving entire cities empty with thousands of people. We're not letting food in. People are dying from diseases because no medicine is getting through, and from hunger because no food is coming in. She's very critical. So then right away, Ben Shapiro, who was her boss, fired her. And that was a huge scandal here in the United States. But she kept going. What she did was become independent. She became an independent YouTuber. I think she's one of the most successful in the US, with something like 4 million views or downloads a day. Her show is #1 or #2 in the country. Then Tucker Carlson followed, as did politicians within the party, Marjorie Taylor Greene, the representative from Georgia, and Congressman Thomas Massey, who is super conservative, a paleo-conservative. Also Rand Paul, Senator Rand Paul, who follows a libertarian line, von Mises style. All the libertarians are also embedded within the Republican Party, and they said it for other reasons too, partly for humanitarian reasons, but mostly for fiscal ones.
Pero más que nada por la razón fiscal. Oye, ¿qué hacer? Elegimos a Trump porque era América primero.
Hey, what can we do? We chose Trump because he was America first. So why are we sending our money to Israel so they can keep killing people? Why do we keep sending money to Israel so they can go on killing thousands and thousands of people every month? That's not what we elected Trump for. And then that sentiment echoed among the masses. It resonated with a lot of people. You have to understand that unlike what happens in many European countries, the Republican Party here, with Trump, has become a populist party. And what I mean is, It's normal or conventional in many European countries for the working class masses, what we call blue-collar workers here, the factory workers, to be associated with the left politically, with the unions, and to lean center-left, with the Socialist Party in Spain, with the center-left parties in the United Kingdom, in Germany, and so on. Not here. Here, thanks to Trump, the opposite happens. The masses of workers, who yes, were certainly on the left and associated with the Democratic Party, manual laborers, Trump pulled them away from the Democratic Party. They're what we call here the Reagan Democrats. Because these people, when Reagan was around in the 1980s, were Democrats. They left the party because they really liked Reagan. He was the cowboy, the movie star, the strong man from Hollywood, the one who was going to end communism, a patriot. They liked guns and Rambo movies, and all those cultural factors drew them to the Republican Party. When Reagan retired from politics in the late 80s, they went back again to the center-left Democratic Party, until Trump came along 10 years ago. And because of Trump's speech, these people, these Reagan Democrats, are returning once again to the Republican Party and becoming members of the Republican Party again. In other words, they're factory workers, the people who suffer the most from inflation in gas, food, and meat. But culturally, they're with Trump because they like his personality. They're against uncontrolled immigration. They like guns, pistols, car racing, mixed martial arts, and culturally, they're right-wing. They go to church every Sunday. In other words, culturally, Trump attracted them. But then these people started to protest because they said, why are we sending billions of dollars to Israel when we should be focusing here in Ohio, here in Wisconsin, here in Pennsylvania, here in the factories? This is where we're suffering. People are unemployed. Our paychecks don't stretch anymore because meat has gotten so expensive. Why are we sending $20 billion to Milei in Argentina? In fact, where the heck is Argentina? I think it's a country somewhere in Central America. I don't even know where. People don't even know where Argentina is, let's be honest. So why are we sending them $20 billion? We elected Trump so he would focus on America. America first. That's why we elected Trump. So why Trump is... That's why we chose Trump. So why is Trump sending money to Israel? Why does he keep sending it to Israel and Argentina instead of focusing here? I mean, what Candace Owens started, what Tucker Carlson continued, what politicians like Thomas Massie, Rand Paul, and Marjorie Taylor Greene followed up on, really resonated with the grassroots, especially with the working class base in the United States, what we call the Rust Belt, Roosevelt's territory, the heavy factories in Ohio, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Minnesota, Michigan, and so on. It struck a chord, and they're saying, we're with you, Tucker, we're with you, Trump. Stop sending money over there. Focus on us. We're the ones who elected you. And the interview Trump did a few days ago on Fox News was awful because it went terribly for him. It was supposed to be a softball interview, as we say here, an easy one from Fox News, which is completely Zionist and completely aligned. But Laura Ingraham, I think she was the journalist, asked him about those visas for Indians who come here to steal jobs from American workers. We need them, Trump said. We'll keep issuing thousands and thousands and thousands of H-1B visas. And that hit American workers like a bomb, because what those visas do is if there's a job that pays $100,000, they bring in an Indian worker, bring him here, and pay him $50,000, half as much. And it's not temporary. They leave them there permanently. So people from big companies, from large factories, fight for these visas because it's much cheaper for them to bring in Indians for those jobs than to hire Americans from here. So that interview on Sunday, the one Trump did, was awful. We can see how this message of anti-Zionism, of why they're sending money over there, why they're bringing in hundreds of thousands of people from other continents, is resonating with the MAGA base, with the Republican Party base.
Ron, to what extent is this shaping Trump's politics? And above all, his foreign policy and his stance toward Israel and Palestine? Because up to now, Trump has always faithfully supported Israel. In fact, many Zionists appear around him, including Israeli Americans, Americans and Israelis with dual citizenship. Well, Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, his daughter's husband, and Vitkov too, many people around him. In his speeches, he always presents himself as Israel's best friend. Despite rumors about Trump's supposed lack of sympathy toward Netanyahu. But beyond that, publicly, he always appears as a staunch pro-Israel figure. At the same time, this discontent is beginning to emerge within his electoral base, with very prominent figures like Tucker Carlson giving very harsh talks against Israel, highly critical analyses of Israel, as you just mentioned. But then, the issue of the list also comes up, the famous list from the Epstein files, with the suspicion that Epstein was actually involved in an extortion scheme. He would take members of the American and global elite to an island so they could have relations with underage girls, document it, and then use that to blackmail all those people. They were supposed to release a list, but in the end, they didn't. Now suddenly, rumors are spreading about Trump's possible involvement, whether on that list or in other files. To what extent did this ultimately determine the end of support, or at least a limit, in Trump's policy regarding Israel's attacks on Gaza? Because at some point, Trump clearly stated, "We are not going to endorse the annexation of the West Bank by Israel," or, when he himself presented the peace plan, later modified somewhat by Netanyahu, but in the end, he was the one who presented it. How much is he responding to this internal issue within Trump's politics? In your opinion, how significant is this discontent among his base?
Well, first of all, Trump can't make his policy the same as Likud's, obviously. Likud's policy is very clear. Everyone knows it. Likud wants to annex Gaza, then it wants to annex the West Bank, which used to be called Judea and Samaria. It wants to create the biblical Greater Israel. It also wants to annex part of Syria, and it's already doing so. When al-Assad fell, they went in and expanded their influence. They possibly want to take parts of Jordan and Lebanon as well. They've always pursued their own agenda. Likud's mission from the beginning has been to create Greater Israel. Period. They won't rest. Even if it takes them another 100 years, 50, whatever it is. They want to create Greater Israel. They want to annex all that territory and drive the Palestinians out. That's it. The Palestinians are an obstacle to their Greater Israel plan. That's what they always want to do. Create this new entity, and then assume all the logical consequences of that new entity, which is Greater Israel. Expel the 5 million Palestinians, send them to Jordan or wherever, remove them from there, because that land, according to them, is entirely theirs. Create a larger society, the religious, the ultra-Orthodox who are in coalition with Likud, with the Likud Zionists. Those want to rebuild Greater Israel first, and then build the temple. Rebuild the temple, so that afterward their famous Messiah, whom they've been waiting for 3,000 years, will come. They're not going to leave. That's the goal, period. Obviously, Trump can't fully embrace those objectives and has to at least appear somewhat moderate, because American society isn't ready for that kind of Greater Israel and for expelling 5 million people, ethnically cleansing them. It's not ready for that, so he won't be able to. So Trump's job is, within what he can do, at least slow Netanyahu down a bit. That's why J.D. Vance recently went to Israel. The real mission of J.D. Vance, the vice president in Israel, was to make sure Netanyahu kept his part of the deal and didn't continue the war, because Netanyahu's ministers wanted to carry it on to the end. They wanted to take advantage of that golden opportunity they got on October 7th to completely clear out Gaza, turn it into a parking lot, make it completely uninhabitable, massacre everyone, and then annex it. That was their plan. So Trump tried as much as he could to tell them, no, at least not now, stop. And Trump is trying to slow Netanyahu down, but Netanyahu will go all the way. Netanyahu will keep going, and the Zionists will also go all the way. Because in their minds, God wants them to create greater Israel, to build the temple, and for the Messiah to come, whom they've been waiting for 3,000 years. That's not going to stop there. Trump has to act with some kind of moderation, at least apparent. And one thing must be understood. Trump has to unify the two factions of the party. He needs to please the paleo-conservatives and those who oppose classical Zionism. The base, more or less the working class base, tells him, focus here in the United States. Forget about Argentina, forget about Israel, forget about Iran, forget about that. We need you here in the United States.
We need you here, te necesitamos aquí en Estados Unidos. Pero también necesita a los neocones, también necesita a los globalistas.
But he also needs the neocons. He also needs the globalists. He also needs the Zionists. Remember that this is Trump's religious base. Southern Protestants are all pro-Zionist fanatics and follow Christian Zionism, like Huckabee, whom Trump appointed as ambassador in Jerusalem, in Israel, to please the Protestant Christian Zionists, the Baptists, Adventists, and Pentecostals of the southern United States. He needs both, and I'm going to explain why.
Él necesita los dos, les voy a explicar por qué. De aquí a un año, en noviembre del 2022,
a year from now, in November 2022, it will be decided whether Trump will succeed as president or not. A year from now, it will be decided whether Trump will remain president or not, whether he will have any kind of legacy or not, whether he will end up accused of crimes in court again or not. A year from now. Because a year from now are the congressional elections, the Senate elections, and the House of Representatives elections. And if the Democrats take the Senate or Congress, the House of Representatives, Trump is finished. They're going to try to do a déjà vu of what they did in 2019. Impeach Trump again, remove him, throw him out, put him on trial, and remove him as president. They're not going to allow Trump to pass any kind of law or executive order. They're going to block Trump's agenda and very possibly remove him again, impeach him again. In other words, Trump is putting his legacy on the line, whether he remains president or not next year, 12 months from now, in November 2026. So Trump urgently needs to unify the Republican Party because he can't afford to lose the elections in November 2026. That would be catastrophic for Trump, to lose the elections. I think Trump will continue as he has so far, ambivalent. We like Putin. I shake his hand and smile with him, but we also like Zelensky. We're not going to give Ukraine more weapons. Oh, but we'll sell them to Ukraine. We make peace with Iran. Oh, but the next day we bomb Iran. Netanyahu, we make a peace deal with Netanyahu and play along with him, but Netanyahu always has the right to do whatever he wants, because he's Israel and we love Israel. He's going to continue with strategic ambivalence. And what Trump really needs to do now is give enormous, massive priority to domestic policies in the United States, to the prices of meat, gasoline, food, milk, chicken, rent, and healthcare. That's what he needs to do. The election of a socialist, someone from the far left wing of the Democratic Party, as mayor of New York. It was a very clear signal, and that's how the experts have read it. People in the United States are already tired of foreign policy, of bombing Iran, of giving billions of dollars to Israel, of sending $20 billion to a distant country that many don't even know where it is, called Argentina, of all those things. People need the government, especially the federal government now, to focus inside the United States, in the United States, for the people of the United States to start bringing down prices and inflation. And what happened with Mandami in New York was a clear message for Trump.
Yes, and in fact, that is largely the core of Trump's campaign for his second term. It's the main message, the famous Make America Great Again, to abandon the endless wars around the world and focus on the problems of ordinary Americans, without a doubt. Now, regarding the issue of the midterm elections, according to many analysts, the possibility of a Republican defeat in those elections means that Netanyahu will almost certainly begin a second round of the 12-day war against Iran. For the moment, Trump, or at least his party, appears to control both chambers, despite some internal disputes between Trump and Republican representatives. But for now, the Republican faction closest to Israel maintains control of both chambers. However, if there were a defeat, or at least a less favorable result in the midterm elections, the Democratic Party would gain control of one of the chambers, and that would create many more limitations for Israel in its struggle, especially with Iran. And here we are, beyond Netanyahu's policy toward Iran, or Israel's policy toward Iran, facing the great debate about the relationship between the United States and Israel. Who controls whom? Who determines whom? Does the United States lead Israel? And does Israel serve as the United States aircraft carrier in the region, as Scott Ritter suggests, beyond the internal criticism within the Republican Party? Or on the contrary, does Israel today basically determine U.S. foreign policy through lobbying? This is Mearsheimer's position. At first, both positions, those of the United States and Israel, showed convergence, especially during the Cold War. Well, on that point, everyone more or less agrees. But at least from the 90s onward, with the rise of the neoconservatives and Netanyahu's arrival in power in Israel, this debate has been present among analysts. Once again, Mearsheimer on one side, and from the neoconservatives onward, or at least since that document from Netanyahu's first government. A clean break, they called it. This idea of, we must start wars against all of Israel's enemies, and the United States should sponsor us. The other day, even Tucker Carlson recalled that apparently Netanyahu used to boast about, I control Trump, I control US policy. That's one position. And the other position, Scott Ritter says, no, not really. Beyond all that, Israel represents the United States in the region, and from there begin the US advances against al-Assad's Syria at the time, against the Ayatollah's Iran, against any subversion in Iraq. What is the true direction of this relationship?
Israel controla Estados Unidos, la política exterior de Estados Unidos. ¿Por qué? Porque controla.
Israel controls the United States, the foreign policy of the United States. Why? Because it controls Congress. Simple as that. The U.S. Congress is controlled 75%, 80% by AIPAC. Again, it's the most powerful lobby in U.S. history. AIPAC. Here's some history. You just have to go watch the interviews with Thomas Massie, who is one of the few anti-Zionists in Congress. But you have to listen to what he says, what he tells. As soon as you arrive in the U.S. Congress, the ones who welcome you there are a delegation from AIPAC. And quickly, we're going to take you to Israel, give you a tour of Israel so you can get to know it.
Vamos a llevar a Israel, a darte un tour por Israel para que lo conozcas. Y te vamos a dar donaciones.
And we're going to give you donations, and we're going to hold rallies for your campaigns, and we're going to invite you to dinners, and we're going to put you up in hotels over there in Tel Aviv. And we're going to give you everything for one single purpose, that these senators and congressmen who make it to the United States become fanatics, voting fanatically in favor of Israel's policy. That's it. That's all. In other words, 75 or 80% of the U.S. Congress is, in an extraordinary and complete way, under the influence of the pro-Israel lobby in the United States. You just have to watch Ted Cruz's interview with Tucker Carlson to realize it. And Ted Cruz said it to him several times during the interview. The ones who give you money are AIPAC, the ones who put you there. And Ted Cruz's ideology, no, because it's in Genesis, it's in the Bible. It's very common in this situation. About 25 or 30% of Congress, no, they remain independent. The most left-wing side, so to speak, of the Democratic Party, the Black Caucus, are not at all pro-Zionist. The socialist spirit of Bernie Sanders, of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, obviously doesn't align with Zionism either. But the vast majority, and now obviously the new thing, a small group of congresspeople on the right, in the more paleo-conservative groups like Marjorie Taylor Greene, neither. But 75 or 80% of Congress is closely controlled by AIPAC, and AIPAC is controlled by Israel. There's no doubt about that. Now then, as Scott Ritter says, the United States possibly gets some kind of benefit out of it. They have a larger CIA office in the embassy in Jerusalem, than the one in the embassy in Amman or the embassy in Cairo. Well, yes, possibly so. And there are a lot of people with dual citizenship, Israeli and American, and tech companies do a lot of business there among themselves. These are secondary things, some kind of secondary benefit. Yes. And it's probably safer for a U.S. soldier to spend a vacation in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv than to go to Amman or Cairo, of course. But those are secondary things. The one who controls whom is Israel controls the United States. The only times Israel has had historical problems with the United States are when a president, whether because of intellectual, historical, or religious preparation, has refused to blindly follow Israel. This happened with Carter in the 1970s, because he, a humanitarian person, completely humanitarian, a defender of the rights of the weakest, was deeply affected by the way Israel treated the Palestinians. And it also happened with Obama, although to a lesser extent. Because Obama, being a very intellectual, very studious person, also didn't let himself be swayed and understood very well that Netanyahu was a first-rate manipulator, a first-rate demagogue, who used Americans as pawns, as puppets. Obama realized that, and the gift he gave Netanyahu when he was about to leave office was to order his ambassador to the United Nations to abstain from a vote condemning Israel's illegal settlements in the West Bank. That was the big scandal. Obama, since he was about to leave office, gave that order. In the next condemnation of the illegal settlements in the West Bank, he told his ambassador, abstain, don't vote against it. That was a big scandal. But aside from that, yes, the United States is completely under Israel's control.
Yes, I also remember Bush Sr. at some point imposing some kind of limit on Israel, and according to many analysts, that determined his later defeat in the elections against Clinton, right? But yes, indeed, all US presidents, regardless of their political affiliation, always support Israeli policy. Now, Ron, do you think this is mainly due to the AIPAC lobby, or are major American Zionist magnates also involved?
Estadounidenses sionistas. Puedo recordar ahora
I can recall now technoligarchs like Peter Thiel, from Palantir, with many interests naturally, both in Israel and in the US defense sector. Larry Ellison from Oracle, Zuckerberg from Facebook, Larry Fink from BlackRock. Who do you think is creating this situation? Directly Israel through AIPAC, or even the Israeli secret services, like Mossad, embedded within the Pentagon or the CIA and so on, or the major American Zionist oligarchs, whether Jewish or not? Because not all Zionists are Jewish, yes.
Sionistas judíos o no, sí, porque no todos judíos los sionistas, sí.
No, AIPAC es quien gobierna directamente.
No. AIPAC is the one that directly governs Congress. AIPAC, that's its mission. In fact, every member of the U.S. Congress, I don't know how many there are, I think around 600, 700 or so, has an AIPAC agent assigned to them. If I'm Roniel Aledo, a congressman from Florida for a certain district, I have someone from AIPAC assigned to me who will look at every vote I cast, the speeches I give, who will call me, invite me to dinners and fundraising events, dinners for me, funds for me, and so on. Every single member of the U.S. Congress has a person from AIPAC assigned to them. And it's through AIPAC that millions and millions of dollars go to those who support Israel, or millions of dollars against those who oppose it.
O millones de dólares a los que están en contra si yo estoy en contra de Israel, a mi contrincante.
If I'm against Israel, that money goes to my opponent. Recently, there was a Democratic election in Michigan, a Democratic Party primary. Obviously, Michigan is one of the areas with the largest Muslim population. There's a huge Arab and Muslim community in Dearborn Heights, on the outskirts of Detroit, and so on. And one of the two congressmen, I believe, had much stronger ties with the Muslim community and was against Zionism, while the other was very pro-Zionist. Guess what AIPAC did? AIPAC gave a lot of money to the slightly more pro-Zionist congressman simply to prevent the Muslim candidate, the one who was more critical of Zionism, from winning the primary. This is how AIPAC operates. They have the money, they have the control. Now, again, in the United States, there are thousands and thousands of people with dual citizenship. There are thousands and thousands of American Jews, whether or not they hold Israeli citizenship, who are fanatically Zionist, and these people have enormous economic power. On Wall Street, in New York, and Hollywood as well, these people use that influence, whether through the press, advertising campaigns, multi-million-dollar donations to the most Zionist candidates, donations to AIPAC so they can direct that money to specific candidates, or also by controlling the media, like Fox News.
Controlar la prensa como Fox News. Fox News es una de las razones por la que echaron a Tucker Carlson de Fox News.
Fox News.
Se estaba alejando.
One of the reasons Tucker Carlson was fired from Fox News was because he was moving away, had moved far away from the neocon globalist articles of faith. He spoke in favor of Russia, criticized Zelensky, wasn't a cheerleader, wasn't a Netanyahu fanatic, and that's why he was fired from Fox News. It's one of the most powerful networks in the United States, one that aligns precisely with the center-right. It's the center-right news channel, the Republican Party's channel, and they fired him from there. Now he's very successful, but as an independent, precisely because he didn't go along with Fox News's neocon globalist dogmas.
Por aquí, por cierto, la página de Track.
By the way, the Track AIPAC page, or AIPAC tracking, is very good. It's a site that documents the positions of politicians in the United States and the contributions from the Israeli lobby to those candidates. Here you can see the possible Democratic candidates, practically all of them, including Kamala Harris, of course, Pritzker, the governor of Illinois, and Cory Booker as well. All of them have received money from AIPAC, including the governor of California, Newsom.
AIPAC y el gobernador de California, Newsom.
That possibly Newsom won't be the last president.
Indeed, up until Mamdani's election, who was publicly Trump's main opponent as governor of California. The only ones without AIPAC support, without AIPAC sponsorship, and with a critical stance on Palestine are Alejandra Ocasio-Cortez, not Alejandria, but Alejandra Ocasio-Cortez, and Rokana. These two within the Democrats. And if we go through the list, well, here we have Tim Wolf, George Shapiro, well, all of them. The Republicans here, literally all of them. And not just those from the Republican establishment, the lifelong Republican leaders like Ted Cruz, Ron DeSantis, and so on, but even the MAGA members as well. Tulsi Gabbard, with money received, Nikki Haley, Robert Kennedy Jr., as always, Marco Rubio, obviously too, Trump Jr. as well, Vance too. So all of them, Ron, absolutely all of them.
Todos, Ron, absolutamente todos.
No, es que es así, es un poder.
That's how it is. That's how it is. It's an extraordinary power. I'm telling you, 80% or more of Congress is in AIPAC's hands. That's the great power. That's the mission, and it has worked spectacularly for them.
A propósito
Speaking of both parties, the Democrats and the Republicans in the United States, and this reconversion, although once again, the Israeli lobby is present on both sides, and even in the popular reconversion of republicanism with MAGA, which has won over the blue-collar vote, the manual workers. Despite all this, the Israeli lobby is there. But beyond the Israeli issue, let's set that aside for a moment. What situation, Ron, are you witnessing within American society regarding polarization? Because beyond this issue of AIPAC being involved in every corner of politics on both sides of the Rio Grande, in matters such as identity, religion, or government intervention in different areas of life, increasingly intense clashes are emerging. The other day, people opposed to Trump held demonstrations across the United States, with 7 million people in the streets, and Trump responded with an animation of himself wearing a king's crown in response to the "No Kings" slogan of the protests. And in that animation, made with artificial intelligence, it somehow seemed to be flying over the demonstrations and bombing them with feces. That's on one side. But on the other, when, for example, Hillary Clinton or Kamala Harris herself refer to Trump from the Democratic side, they portray him as Hitler, as the devil on earth. This polarization, to what extent could it lead to a civil war in the United States, or at least to a direct and increasingly intense confrontation, not between politicians anymore, but within American society itself?
Well, a civil war as such seems extraordinarily unlikely to me, you know? Because for a scenario like that, you'd need governors to mobilize their state's national guards to break away from the United States as a whole, or for some faction of the military to rise up against another. That, to me, seems incredibly improbable. What is true, though, is that the situation has become extremely polarized in recent years. Because up until about 10 years ago, until 2015, when Trump left the world of entertainment and business to present himself as a politician, the United States was in a pretty normal situation, so to speak. Center-right, center-left, center-right, center-left. And there wasn't that kind of polarization. Like saying you were with the CDU or the Socialists in Germany, or with the PSOE or the PP. There wasn't a big difference between center-right and center-left. But with Trump, the situation changed, because a lot of people, so to speak, radicalized their discourse. Or rather than radicalizing it, they came out of anonymity, so to speak. Many groups came out of anonymity, both from the conservative and Christian right, as well as libertarians, people who are against illegal immigration, and also more extreme groups, so to speak, nationalist groups, the Tea Party, who came out to support Trump, etc. So that caused polarization. As a reaction to that, many of the dogmas, so to speak, or semi-dogmas that the Democratic Party had already established, that immigration is good, that it should be promoted, that multiculturalism should be promoted, that the United States is a secular country, that there is no place for religion in the public sphere, that trans movements and the LGBT movement should be promoted and legalized, all these things. Trump and his group began to attack them. Then, as a reaction, they came out with a counterproductive response. No, then Trump is satanic, Trump is Hitler, Trump is this. And his followers are trash, his followers are deplorable, his followers are uneducated people, ignorant country folks, illiterate, and so on. So that division has intensified enormously. Biden's victory in 2020 also greatly contributed to that polarization, because on one hand there are people who, so to speak, came out of anonymity and are deeply aligned with Trump. But there are also reactionary groups on the left who are strongly against Trump and identify themselves as Antifas, or radicals in favor of the trans movement, the feminist movement, or immigration. And if you wear a Trump hat, you're automatically a racist, a Nazi, and we're going to attack you. Families have been torn apart. Before, there was the famous Thanksgiving scene where all the families would gather. Now many of those gatherings no longer happen, or they've split into different houses because the uncle doesn't want to be with the niece, since the niece was pro-Kamala Harris, radical, pro-feminist, and pro-trans, and the uncle was pro-Trump and spoke in favor of Trump. So there's been a very deep change in society. Let's say that in Germany everyone were either Republican or from Alternative for Germany on one side and Communist on the other, and that the CDU and the Socialists had become minority parties, so to speak. That's what has happened here. Society is polarized, and the opposing sides have grown stronger. And that's why there's so much polarization. Culture follows wherever the government goes. Culture keeps going that way. Many movies that have come out recently, this year, have been major flops because they were produced in 2023 and 2024 when everyone was sure the Democrat would win, that Kamala Harris would win. Even if they didn't know it would be Kamala Harris, they already took it for granted. And the message in those movies, the good guys and the bad guys, the whole message, was completely in favor of Biden's ideology and the left-wing ideology. Then they found, to their surprise, that the movie's producers and directors said, boom, it's 2025 and Trump won. So the movies clashed and were a tremendous failure. The box office, or cultural things like the UFC, people say that doesn't matter at all. No, it has great sociological importance, because the first thing Trump did, and you can go see it on YouTube, as soon as he won, was go to the UFC, where he was received like a king, with his whole entourage, hundreds of thousands of people. The UFC is the largest MMA organization in the world, mixed martial arts, and it's something extraordinary.
Wrestling too, right, Ron? Wrestling too, WWE.
Trump took part in professional wrestling when he was a businessman. Of course, because all of that is a performance, but he participated in it several times. They invited him when he was a showbiz businessman doing his program The Apprentice and so on, and he would appear. But the UFC has a cultural implication. It's much more associated with center-right people, Trump's working-class supporters, people from inland areas, who like it more than the intellectuals from big cities. And when Trump went to the UFC and was received by thousands and thousands of people, the champion who won gave his title to Trump, started dancing like Trump. That sends a signal of cultural change. In other words, the revolution Biden tried to start has come to an end. I don't know, maybe when Trump leaves there will be another revolution of a different kind. But culturally things have now shifted. Movies, sports, to the right. In other words, there's been total polarization in politics and also in society, on both sides.
In fact, Joe Rogan, one of the UFC commentators, hosts one of the most watched podcasts in the United States, with an openly pro-Trump MAGA stance and, at the very least, clearly opposed to the woke Democratic ideology, without a doubt. And on the WWE side, in professional wrestling, the wife, not Vince McMahon, but his wife, because at one point Vince McMahon, the wrestling CEO, well, suddenly became involved in abuse cases, so his wife took over and sponsored Trump with a lot of money as one of his main donors. In contrast, I remember the case of the NBA, which was very critical of Trump, as a sports league more connected to the black community, and therefore anti-Trump. But in this scenario, Ron, what possible way out is there?
Ron, ¿qué salida posible? Porque yo recuerdo que en Estados Unidos, más allá de las...
Because I remember that in the United States, beyond the usual political disputes, there's this division between the coasts and the Democratic voters, people supposedly with higher academic backgrounds, and the Americans from deep America, more connected to the land, to the countryside. The famous American myth. So many movies about this. I remember one now with Michael Fox, about the city guy who arrives in a small town, but in the end, the town wins his heart. At first, they rejected him, but later they didn't. And despite all that, in the history of the United States, at some point the anthem would begin, the flag would appear waving, and both Democrats and Republicans would suddenly respond with their hands over their hearts before the flag, eyes full of tears, moved, and the unity of the United States beyond political colors.
De los Estados Unidos más allá de los colores políticos. Esta situación, la cual vos estás caracterizando también con el UFC, con otras...
This situation, which you're also describing with the UFC and other issues, doesn't seem sociologically like one that could be rescued toward the unity of the United States, because there appears to be a very deep rupture beyond the elites at the level of ordinary people. What solution could you propose? Could there be some way out of this situation in the United States? Or am I exaggerating in my interpretation? And in reality, this is just about politics and nothing more. While among ordinary Americans, everyone gets along, and society doesn't actually seem divided.
Bueno,
no aparece partida la sociedad.
Bueno, sí, está muy partida la sociedad. De nuevo, yo creo que Trump...
Well, yes, society is very divided. Again, I think Trump started a cultural and sociological movement because his discourse broke all the rules of political correctness when he began in 2016, and this brought many groups in society out of anonymity, things they thought but didn't dare to say. Trump said them. I give a fairly broad explanation of this whole phenomenon. Anyone who wants to read it can go to El Español Digital and look for my articles. There's one I wrote called Trump, the Frankfurt School, and the Counter-Revolution.
Trump, la escuela de Frankfurt y la contrarrevolución. Trump, la escuela de Frankfurt y la contrarrevolución. Yo puedo explico
Trump, the Frankfurt School, and the Counter-Revolution. I can explain the social, sociological, and cultural reasons for this polarization. It seems to me that as long as Trump continues to act, or Trump's ideology, or the people close to him remain in politics, especially in the presidency, in a way that's close to Trump or as his successor, let's say J.D. Vance wins the 2028 elections. Possibly J.D. Vance will be president, or it will be Newsom from California. Those are the two major candidates everyone is watching right now. Governor Newsom of California will very likely be the Democratic candidate, and J.D. Vance will be the Republican Party's candidate. There could be some surprise, but 95% of analysts here see it this way: Vance or Newsom. If J.D. Vance wins, polarization will obviously continue because J.D. Vance is also very far to the right, some say even further to the right than Trump, and much colder toward Ukraine than Trump. It was J.D. Vance who started telling Zelensky off in February when Zelensky came to the White House. It was J.D. Vance who started it. President Zelensky, you're being disrespectful. He was the one who started the fight that later escalated, but he was the one who began it. I mean, this is going to continue if J.D. Vance wins. The only way this could change is if someone like Tulsi Gabbard wins, who is currently aligned with Trump, or if one of Trump's children wins in the future, if Eric or Donald Jr. go into politics, or if Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is super aligned with Trump, becomes vice president or something like that, and also wins. The only way this could, so to speak, be normalized is if a candidate from the super moderate establishment wing, what we call here the Republican Party's establishment bosses, were to win. Someone like Nikki Haley, someone like Romney used to be until recently, one of those little centrists, as Juan Manuel de Prada calls them in an article titled Moderadito. I recommend it too. Go check out Juan Manuel de Prada's Moderaditos.
Los recomiendo también, vayan a leer los Moderaditos de Juan Manuel de Prada. A menos que ganen uno de estos moderados de centro.
Unless one of those centrist moderates wins and manages to establish an ideological dynasty, or establishes nothing at all, because usually these people are, as they say, bland as an egg without salt. They have no ideology whatsoever. They're passive people who give the same repetitive, boring, normalizing political speech. So if one of these ordinary, mild-mannered types comes along, takes over the Republican Party and wins the presidency, then we'll see things shift back to the center, to the usual center-right or center-left. Boring, ordinary, and polarization will decrease. That's the only solution. But if in the 2028 or 2032 elections, people who are closely aligned with Trump, or who call themselves Trump's successors, keep winning, polarization will continue.
Bien, la última, Ron.
All right, the last one, Ron. About Trump again. To what extent is he fulfilling his promises regarding US foreign policy? We can discuss domestic policy another time, because during his campaign he promised to end the war in Ukraine within 24 hours. And while he did begin making real changes in his relationship with Ukraine, he didn't completely withdraw support. He was also supposedly going to pursue a rapprochement with Russia, apparently aiming for a policy similar to that of Nixon's Secretary of State at the time, Kissinger, to create a triangulation of the United States with Mao Zedong's China against the Soviet Union. Well, apparently Trump wanted to re-establish closer ties with Russia to create an axis opposed to China, but beyond the meeting in Alaska, things between the two, and between the United States and Russia, still seem very, very tense. As for the end of the wars, in the end, it didn't really determine the conclusion of US intervention abroad. He backed the US with Iran, well, carried out attacks against Yemen, and is now massing troops near Venezuela. It feels like a yes, no situation, black or white, depending on the day. What's your take on all this?
No, tiene razón, que sí, que no, que sí, que no. Blanco.
No, you're right. Yes, no, white one day, black the next. Trump's policy has been very disappointing for those of us who expected him to really end the war. And the only way to do that is simply to cut off all aid to Zelensky, stop the intelligence sharing, and that's it. It would be over in a couple of months, and he hasn't done it. And obviously his intervention in Iran was disappointing, and the money he's giving to Israel is also disappointing. All of this is disappointing. One thing must be understood. Trump doesn't have his hands free. They're tied. Yes, he has a lot of good people. I'd say one of the best in his administration is Tulsi Gabbard. Yes, she's getting money from IPAC and all, but Tulsi has been very aligned with Tucker Carlson from the start regarding Russia, saying the war must end, that the money given to Ukraine must stop, and so on. And he has very good people like Tulsi, and also good people in his ear like Tucker. Tucker still calls him and talks to him, but he also has very bad people on the other shoulder. It's like having a little angel and a little devil, a little angel here and a demon here. And he has demons. The little demon assigned to him, the one on his shoulder, is Sebastian Gorka, who is a rabid, furious, Russophobic, globalist neocon. Very possibly he's also an MI6 infiltrator. Sebastian Gorka has all the globalist neocons in Congress, people like Graham, Ted Cruz, and Cotton, who are furious against Russia, who hate Russia, fanatical Zionists, people who represent the most rabid neocon globalism, who still believe we're in 1984, who haven't realized that the Soviet Union no longer exists, that Russia is no longer communist, that the Communist Party is an opposition party, that it has nothing to do with United Russia. People who still, in their minds, live in 1984 and are fighting against the Warsaw Pact, and he needs them. These people have great influence over Trump, and Trump, unfortunately and sadly, needs them again for the reasons I mentioned. Next year, at this same time, in November 2026, the congressional elections will take place, and Trump cannot, under any circumstances, or in any way, allow the Democrats to win. He needs to please the entire party. He needs to unify the entire party. He desperately needs a Republican Party victory. Because if the Republican Party loses, if the Democrats win, it's the end of Trump. It's catastrophic for him. They'll do to him again what they did in 2019. They'll overwhelm him. They'll try to oust him. They'll impeach him. They'll try to remove him in the harshest way possible. His legacy will be over, and so on. The hope, the faith that some of us have, the hope we have, I at least on a personal level, is that once the November 2026 elections are over and the Republican Party wins, Trump will be rubbing his hands, he'll have his hands free, he won't need Graham or Cotton or Ted Cruz or all the bunch of neocons he has in Congress. He'll be able to act in a much freer, more instinctive way, much more in line with his ideology and his worldview, his geopolitical vision. Because up to now, he needs these people, and his hands are tied. Our hope is that after the elections, Trump can carry out these last 2 years of government in a way that's much more faithful to his project, much more America first, and much less neoconism and much less globalism.
Just as a side note, where does Steve Bannon stand on the issue of Israel? Which side is he on? I'm asking out of ignorance, you know.
Very, very critical of Israel as well. Very critical of Israel. Again, many people who until recently had remained silent or timidly pro-Israel in the past few months. And again, it all started with Cardenas a year ago. They have, so to speak, come out of the closet, and he has also presented himself as a critic of Israel. In fact, he recently had a very famous online debate with Zionists, with journalists who tried to corner him. No, America first! And Trump is failing his promise. He's failing America first. A paleo-conservative position very similar to Tucker Carlson's.
Bien. Estimado Ron.
All right, dear Ron, thank you so much for joining us today. I wanted to remind everyone of the names of your Twitter and YouTube channels. Roniel Aledo, ex-CIA contractor, both on Twitter, or now X, and on YouTube. And well, as is customary on our channel, Ron, the final words are yours. If there's anything left unsaid, whatever you'd like, this is your moment.
Nothing. Thank you so much for the invitation. I invite everyone to follow me on Twitter and YouTube as well. And really, thank you very much, Ezequiel. And let's see if we meet this summer. If you're in Berlin, maybe I'll drop by.
Oh, great, spectacular. In 15 minutes, the show starts on our sister channel, MP Geopolitics, hosted by Fernando Moragon. Don't miss it. We'll be back here again tomorrow and on Sunday too, like every Sunday. Cheers and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Saludos y hasta la próxima. Chau, chau.
¿Qué?